It is incredibly common for horror films to fumble the test of time, due to poorly aged effects and social mores that are unpalatable to modern audiences. But there are those rare horror films, my friends, which actually somehow find a way to become scarier with time. Perhaps they tap into an aspect of society which has only become more relevant years or even decades later. Or maybe their aged visuals actually only enhance the spooky, lived-in feel of the entire movie. And so, inspired by a recent Reddit thread on the very subject, I'm Gareth, this is What Culture Horror, and here are 10 horror movies that got scarier years later. Number 10, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and unquestionably one that actually benefits from its scuzzy, low-rent production values. The grotty central location, ultra-grainy 60mm film stock, and unvarnished performances contribute to a movie that truly feels less like a work of cinema than a grotesque curiosity we weren't ever supposed to see. It is perhaps cinema's quintessential you'll want to shower after watching this movie, and in an era where even low-budget modern horror films have relatively sharp, polished visuals, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre feels like an artifact from another time. It is a rarest instance of a film whose garishness only enhances its effectiveness. And so, one can imagine that when horror fans watch it 50 years from now or something, they'll find it even more discomfortingly off-piste than we do now. I mean, if that's even possible. Number 9, Pulse 2001. 2001's J-horror classic, Pulse, was a deeply ahead of its time film about the loneliness of modern society, and the isolation which can be fostered by the internet, as ghosts invade the living world through the World Wide Web. Back in the early 2000s, it seemed a little easier to enjoy Pulse purely as a well-crafted but resolutely silly tech horror flick, as was a popular horror subgenre at the time. But over 2 decades on, Pulse's depiction of people losing their connection to humanity through the internet feels more trenchant and scary than ever. With social media desperately trying to make us all as terminally online as possible, and many eschewing flesh and blood appointments in favor of parasocial relationships, Pulse's messaging has a far greater urgency and impact to it when viewed today. In fact, it's honestly shocking that Hollywood hasn't yet mounted a second remake for the social media era, because the angle basically writes itself, doesn't it? Number 8, The Exorcist. The Exorcist is a rite of passage horror movie for many youngsters getting into the genre, and as a result, it's a film whose horrors perhaps don't fully resonate until viewing it again with a more mature mindset. William Friedkin's genre masterpiece may be best remembered for swiveling heads, pea soup vomit, and the power of Christ compels you, but it's so much more than that. Thematically, The Exorcist is wholly concerned with crisis of faith in a fast-changing America, and the terror of protecting one's own child from the unknowable. Ideas which will likely pass younger viewers by on an initial watch, but obviously scream loudly when revisiting the film later on. Even though its effects work might seem quaint and its scares even tame to modern audiences, The Exorcist is definitely a grower of a horror movie whose icy eeriness sets in like rot and never really goes away. Now I've got a quick question for you. What is the movie that you would suggest as someone getting into the horror genre for the first time? Would you go for The Exorcist or would you go for something else? You let me know in the comment section down below. Now back to the video. Number 7, The Purge. Remember when the Purge movies were nothing more than ridiculous, pulpy fantasy without any conceivable grounding in reality? Those were the days. Except with political polarization reaching a fever pitch, America electing Donald Trump to the presidency, and potentially doing it all over again in November, the very concept of The Purge has never felt more within our own political ballpark. While the president would definitely struggle to ever enact an annual purge on their own authority, the terrifying Project 2025 mandate, which would nudge the US into autocracy, certainly sounds like something the Purge's far-right party, the New Founding Fathers of America, would approve of. Now again, a day of state-authorized mayhem under Trump isn't exactly probable, but it doesn't seem quite as absurd as it did a decade ago, does it? Which is scary to say in of itself. When John Carpenter-esque B-movie exploitation flicks are starting to seem less like fully far-flung fiction, it's reasonable to be a bit concerned. Number 6, Day of the Dead. Day of the Dead's central theme is about communication, or rather how the failure to communicate will doom us all. The scientists and soldiers holed up together in an underground bunker find themselves struggling to adhere to the basic principles of social dialogue, as an undead apocalypse unfolds all around them, ensuring that the majority of them end up dead before the credits roll. Humanity's inability to cleanly communicate in a crisis wasn't exactly a revelation in 1985, let alone today, but it does feel ever more pressing through a contemporary lens. In an era where social media algorithms strive to perpetuate the culture war and drive an even larger wedge between political divides, where civil discourse across party lines becomes increasingly rare, Day of the Dead's lessons actually feel more relevant today than ever. And so it's perhaps fitting that Day of the Dead released to relatively mixed reviews compared to predecessors Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, with its esteem only growing more positive over the years. Thank you very much for checking out this What Culture Horror list today, you lovely person. And if you're enjoying what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below and you'll get more of this horror stuff in your life. Now back to the video. Number 5, The Omen. Richard Donner's The Omen is one of the greatest and scariest horror films of all time, and one that only feels ever more ominously relevant in the current era of fast fundamentalism. Now, in the case of The Omen, Damien, the child that Robert Thorne is trying to murder, actually is the Antichrist, and so there's very clear justification for Robert's actions. And yet, with some slight tweaks to the story, it's easy to see how The Omen could instead become a horrifying commentary on extremist radicalization, whereby someone falls down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, becomes convinced that a young child is the Antichrist, and promptly attempts to kill them. We've seen similar tragic news headlines in reality, and so to consider how the wider world would understandably believe Robert to have lost his damn mind, it lends the film a chilling wider relevance today, where it's easier than ever for otherwise sensible people to get sucked into conspiracies. Number 4, Halloween 3: Season of the Witch. When Halloween 3: Season of the Witch was first released in 1982, all anyone would talk about was the absence of franchise icon Michael Myers, rather than actually considering the merits of what was in the movie. And so, for years, Halloween 3 was basically the outcast entry of the series. The goofy one where a corporation conspires to murder children by placing cursed microchips inside Halloween masks. But in recent years, there has been a considerable turnaround on Halloween 3's reputation, as fans have finally stopped pining for Mikey and engaged with the film on its own terms. About damn time too. Even accepting the undeniable silliness of its premise, Season of the Witch's anti-capitalist messaging has aged shockingly well. In an era where corporations can only scarcely contain their contempt for the average person, consumer, and regular folk perhaps feel more disenfranchised than ever before, the movie's bleak hopelessness strikes a chord more now even than it did 4 decades ago. Number 3, Candyman 1992. It's a testament to the original 1992 Candyman that its themes and ideas hold up incredibly well today, regardless of 2021's so-so sequel. With its titular quote-unquote villain being the ghost of a black man who was murdered for daring to have a relationship with a white woman, Candyman obviously has a lot on its mind about the place of black men in America. But it goes further than that, intelligently examining issues such as gentrification, which are of course still stingingly relevant today. And honestly, Candyman is an even more discomforting sit in 2024, considering how little real progress has actually been made in over 3 decades. Depressing stuff, really. It's easy to rewatch the movie and remark how American society is still deeply mired in these problems, and struggles to simply let the black community peacefully exist free of oppression and hostility. Though the aforementioned sequel sought to expand upon these themes, the original film's message continues to resonate perfectly well on its own all these years later. Number 2, Misery. Now, there's no denying that Misery has always been absolutely terrifying, largely thanks to Kathy Bates' Oscar-winning performance as Annie Wilkes, an obsessive fan of author Paul Sheldon who ends up holding him captive. But when Stephen King penned the original 1987 novel on which the movie is based, he surely couldn't have anticipated how toxic fandom would become a widely discussed concept in mainstream pop culture some 3 decades later. And if he did, that is impressive. Annie is an exaggerated reflection of anyone who's ever made their favourite piece of pop culture their entire personality, to the extent that they become genuinely unhinged when said franchise does something they just do not like. Look at Star Wars fans' volcanic reaction to The Last Jedi, or the overwhelming petitioning for HBO to reshoot the reviled final season of Game of Thrones, both of which spilled over into some fans harassing the cast and crew involved. Yeah, don't do that. With social media making it so incredibly easy for overzealous fans to spew their bile into the world, and potentially even in the direction of the actual creatives, Misery's depiction of disturbed fanaticism feels arguably far realer and a lot less far-fetched than it did in 1990. And number 1, The Entity. Content warning, sexual assault will be mentioned in this next entry. 1982's The Entity is a fascinatingly unique and unforgettable horror film, in which a single mother is sexually assaulted by an invisible supernatural force. As absurd a setup as that might sound, it's executed with serious-minded panache by filmmaker Sidney J. Furie, aided by a phenomenal performance from the great Barbara Hershey. And while The Entity has always been well regarded by critics, it's never really had the wider popularity it deserved, perhaps in part due to its explicit subject matter. Yet the onset of the Me Too movement in 2017 saw a number of think pieces reevaluate the film in an entirely new context. The struggle of Hershey's protagonist Carla to be believed while battling an enemy who is literally hidden from view hits somewhat differently in light of Me Too. For while these issues obviously existed back in the 1980s, the recent strides forward have brought that struggle into mainstream culture, rather than cloistering it away. If audiences of the past could have more easily engaged with The Entity as a fantastical genre film, to modernize, it's impossible to ignore the basically direct parallels to reality. If you've enjoyed this 10 horror movies that got scarier years later list today, my friend, then why not take this 10 horror movie remakes that were totally different video for a spin too? You'll have a blast, trust me. Bye bye.